In the middle of England's blood-soaked civil war, an old woman was locked inside a room and forced to stay awake for days, while men waited for something impossible to happen. They claimed she was part of a hidden satanic network spreading witchcraft across the country. At first, the accusations sounded absurd, until the witnesses inside the room began describing shapes moving in the corners after midnight. This witchcraft documentary takes you to one of the darkest witch trials in English history, a case so disturbing that it transformed fear into a national obsession. A one-legged woman living on the edge of society became the center of a black magic horror that convinced an entire nation the devil was no longer hiding in hell, but walking openly through the towns of Essex. As the interrogations grew more brutal, strange names started appearing in the official records. Names that didn't belong to people, creatures that allegedly answered when called. A white animal with dead eyes, a thing that moved without legs, and something so horrifying that even hardened investigators reportedly struggled to describe it without shaking. But here's the question that still haunts historians centuries later. Were these merely the hallucinations of exhausted men trapped in a room poisoned by paranoia? Or did the witch trials of Manningtree uncover something they were never supposed to see? In the bleak spring of 1645, England was not just a nation at war. It was an active, apocalyptic nightmare where the social order had entirely collapsed into blood, terrible violence, and ashes. The fields lay completely fallow, the fractured king was in desperate flight, and the skies over the county of Essex hung heavy with a suffocating, terrifying sense of an impending, completely unavoidable cosmic doom. In the isolated town of Manningtree, fearful citizens whispered that the sudden collapse of the kingdom was not merely a political failure, but a calculated, physical manifestation of the devil's active work on earth. Neighbors began to look at one another with predatory suspicion, searching for the hidden, malignant cancer that had brought the furious wrath of God down upon this small, cursed corner of the English world. They found their ultimate scapegoat in the most vulnerable creature imaginable, Elizabeth Clarke, an impoverished, lonely, one-legged elderly woman who lived on the dark, forgotten fringes of the local panicked Manningtree parish. For years, Elizabeth had drifted through the town as a miserable ghost, relying entirely on the bitter charity of her suspicious neighbors and the hidden properties of wild roadside herbs to survive the freezing winters. Her physical deformity made her a striking target, a walking omen of misfortune in a deeply Puritan society that routinely viewed any bodily affliction as an outward sign of an inward, rotting, satanic sin. Enter Matthew Hopkins, a failed, desperate lawyer who saw in Elizabeth's extreme vulnerability a golden opportunity to forge a terrifying new position of absolute judicial authority, transforming himself permanently into the notorious Witchfinder General. Hopkins, alongside his brutal associate, John Stern, seized the old woman and dragged her to the dark, claustrophobic confines of the Thorn Inn, establishing a makeshift interrogation chamber that would soon leak pure horror. They avoided the traditional bloody racks of London, choosing instead a far more psychological weapon known as watching, a systematic process of total sleep deprivation designed to thoroughly shatter the victim's fragile sanity. For 3 consecutive days and nights, Elizabeth was forced to sit on a hard, backless wooden stool in the center of a stifling room, denied a single moment of rest by a rotating shift of watchers. If her heavy eyelids drifted closed for even a second, the watchers would violently yank her to her bare foot, forcing her to walk across the rough floorboards until her remaining leg buckled beneath her. The air inside the Thorn Inn room grew hot and thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, tallow candles, and a heavy, suffocating atmosphere of dread that signaled the thinning of the veil between worlds. Hopkins stood in the corner, his eyes fixed on Elizabeth's twitching hands, searching for the witch's mark, an insensitive spot on the flesh where the familiars supposedly drew blood to sustain the dark, unnatural lives. The psychological warfare was calculated to make the victim feel entirely abandoned by God and humanity, leaving her with no alternative but to surrender to the terrifying narratives pushed by her aggressive captors. By the third night, the physical torture had accomplished its purpose, dissolving the boundaries of Elizabeth's reality and opening a gateway in her mind for the forbidden entities she allegedly kept in secret. Suddenly, the room became deathly cold, the flames of the candles sputtering and turning a sickly, supernatural blue as Elizabeth's head snapped back, her eyes rolling into the white depths of her skull. The watchers froze in terror as she began to murmur in a low, rhythmic cadence that sounded less like a broken woman and more like an ancient priestess summoning forces from the abyss of time. She was calling her imps, the spiritual familiars that the Inquisition claimed were sent directly from the devil to suckle her witch teat and do her malicious bidding across the unsuspecting Essex countryside. To the absolute horror of Matthew Hopkins and the armed guards, the shadows in the corners of the room began to writhe and take solid physical form, defying every natural law of creation. First came Holt, a creature resembling a pristine white kitten. But as it scampered across the floorboards, its movements were unnaturally jerky, its eyes completely hollow and void of any feline life or warmth. Before the men could draw their breath, a second horror materialized from beneath the floor. Jarmara, a fat, sleek spaniel, but as it crawled forward, the watchers screamed to see it possessed no legs. It slithered across the wood like a massive, furry serpent, panting heavily with a wet, human-like breath that filled the confined interrogation room with the sudden, overwhelming stench of stagnant swamp water and rot. Elizabeth laughed, a jagged, terrifying sound that echoed off the stone walls as she welcomed a third entity, Sacke and Sugar, a pitch-black rabbit that immediately began to pace in erratic, geometric circles. But the true climax of sensational horror occurred when the final familiar tore through the fabric of the room, a creature that would forever define the nightmare of the Manningtree witch trials, Vinegar Tom. This entity assumed the long, muscular, lean body of a starving greyhound, but its neck was topped with the massive, horned, bloodshot head of an ox, its jaws dripping with an oily black foam. Vinegar Tom did not act like an animal. It stood on its hind legs, turning its glowing, primordial eyes directly upon Matthew Hopkins, sending a wave of paralyzing, supernatural dread through the future witchfinder. The watchers were paralyzed, unable to move or pray, as the phantom beasts encircled Elizabeth's stool, nuzzling her torn skirts and whispering back to her in low, scratching noises that defied human comprehension. This explicit manifestation of occultism was the definitive turning point, providing Hopkins with the sensational, terrifying proof he needed to convince the courts that an organized satanic conspiracy was actively invading the English nation. The local magistrates, already overwhelmed by the complete breakdown of royal law, looked upon Hopkins' findings not with legal skepticism, but with a profound sense of administrative relief and desperate religious validation. They granted him unprecedented commissions to search the neighboring towns, expanding his authority from a localized dispute in Manningtree into a terrifying, county-wide judicial machine backed by the full weight of Puritan zeal. The sensationalism of the animals seen at the Thorn Inn spread through pamphlets and sermons, terrifying the English public into believing that the devil was actively mobilizing an animalistic army against their souls. Every stray cat, unusual dog, or backyard rabbit in the county of Essex suddenly became a potential target of deadly suspicion, turning the natural world into a minefield of supernatural paranoia and fear. Elizabeth Clarke's broken confession, born from the terror of the watching room, was the catalyst that ignited the deadliest localized witch hunt in English history, transforming Manningtree into an epic center of mass hysteria. The good that this horrific event temporarily brought to the deeply fractured society was a profound, reassuring sense of spiritual cleansing for a population that desperately needed order amidst a chaotic civil war. By believing they were physically rounding up and executing the visible servants of the devil, the community felt they were regaining control over a world that had otherwise spiraled completely out of their hands. However, the bad far outweighed any fleeting comfort, as Elizabeth's confession broke the dam of neighborly trust, forcing her to name other women to save herself from further agonizing torment in the cells. Her betrayal triggered a cascading nightmare that spread like a physical plague across Essex, filling the damp dungeons of Chelmsford Jail with dozens of innocent women who would eventually face the hangman's heavy noose. Elizabeth Clarke was executed by hanging shortly after her tragic trial, a classic scapegoat of a broken legal system and a society driven mad by religious warfare and the highly manipulative ambitions of Matthew Hopkins. Yet the legend of the Thorn Inn, watching refuses to die, lingering in the historical consciousness forever, as the night when the line between human madness and genuine occult manifestation became completely, terrifyingly invisible. The names of her familiars, especially the terrifying image of Vinegar Tom, remain etched in the annals of history. A stark warning of what happens when fear is weaponized by those seeking absolute control over others. When the shadows lengthen in the old streets of Manningtree today, locals still avoid the sight of the old inn, swearing they can hear the faint, erratic scratching of a legless dog on the pavement. They wonder if the imps were merely the desperate illusions of a dying mind, or if Elizabeth Clarke truly tore open a rift in the universe, leaving her spectral army to guard her memory forevermore.